Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's around 7 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. On behalf of the National Park Service and Boston Harbor Now, I'd like to welcome you to our annual lecture series, Revolutionary Harbor. Thank you for joining us for the third and final program in this series. Tonight's speakers will tell you about the Stone Living Lab, an exciting new initiative in Boston Harbor that will use cutting-edge research and public education to help solve some of Boston's most pressing climate change threats. You will hear about the mission of the lab, learn what a living lab is, hear about new research projects, and discover how you can get involved. A few housekeeping matters before we dive in, though. Please note that this presentation will be recorded, but only our speakers will appear on the screen. You can use the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn closed captions on or off. We will save all questions until our presenters have concluded, but please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A window at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the presentation. You're also encouraged to comment and interact with fellow attendees using the chat function. Lastly, we'd like everyone to tell us where they are virtually visiting from. Please feel free to drop your city and state into the chat. I am now pleased to welcome our presenters. Marc Albert is the Director of Natural Resource Partnerships at the National Parks of Boston. Dr. Marc Borrelli is Director of the Coastal Processes and Ecosystems Laboratory at UMass Boston. And Rebecca Shore is the Cabot Education and Community Engagement Program Manager at the Stone Living Lab. Marc, and Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. The time is now yours.
Thank you so much, Jill. Exciting day to be talking to you all. We had some cool lightning and thunder and rain here where I am. It's my second time participating in the Revolutionary Harbor lecture series, and it was a lot of fun last time. So hope we'll get some good feedback and hear from the audience. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully y'all can see the starting slide. We're here to introduce the Stone Living Lab, a collaborative effort to address climate change based here in Boston Harbor with a vision to innovate solutions that can impact coastal cities everywhere. The pollution in Boston Harbor and across the US led to the first environmental revolution with the passage of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, the latter of which ultimately led to the Boston Harbor cleanup. We now have a call to action again for the next environmental revolution, adapting to an increasingly variable climate and intense coastal flooding here. As you all know, we are seeing changes, especially from big storms, such as in March 2018, and several of these photos are from the nor'easter then, but also just from baseline sea level rise. And we get sunny day flooding on very high tides, as can be seen in the bottom middle slide there. Here in the Boston Harbor region, we have all the pieces in place to take action. The city is a national leader in climate preparedness with the Climate Ready Boston program. UMass Boston has an incredible research team that is leading the way on coastal research that is integrative. One of their recent efforts was this harbor barrier study, which looked at the feasibility of these very, very large harbor barrier systems and looked at their ecological, economic, social, and sort of impacts across the board. The authors concluded, as it says there, that sort of shore-based, multi-layered approaches, as is part of the Climate Ready Boston program, is the recommended way forward. Boston Harbor Now, the co-host here, is a leader in climate smart growth, waterfront development, and helping folks access Boston Harbor and the islands and all of the beauty and recreational opportunities of the coast. And at the federal level, the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service have had a climate change response program since the Obama administration. And I would like to note that the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who who is the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, has just recently in the last week or so issued 2 secretarial orders that are relevant to our work here. The first one is entitled Revocation of Secretary's Orders Inconsistent with Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. Yep, that's the title. That order revokes a series of orders issued in recent years inconsistent with the commitment to protect public health, conserve land, water, and wildlife, and elevate science as a part of the dialogue. The second secretarial order, just recently issued, is entitled Department-Wide Approach to the Climate Crisis and Restoring Transparency and Integrity to the Decision-Making Process. That order establishes a climate task force to coordinate work across the Department of the Interior's various agencies, including the National Park Service, including accelerating renewable energy development and identifying actions to foster investments in energy communities. It also provides guidance on how science should be used in the decision-making process and clarifies departmental policy to improve transparency and public engagement in the department's decision-making processes. So all of these partners have now come together to form the Stone Living Lab, an interdisciplinary partnership. What we do in the Stone Living Lab, or what we aim to do in partnership with many, many others, is to conduct transformative research and outreach to help make vulnerable coastal regions adaptive to climate change while also enhancing our local environments. As you can see in the second part of the statement there, the goal is actually engagement. It's not purely a sort of a discrete outcome that we're looking for. We don't know the outcomes we're looking for. The goal is an engagement with as broad a set of constituents as possible to help us co-discover ways to adapt to the climate crisis here in Boston with a goal far beyond Boston. So what is a living lab? A living lab brings research out of the lab and into the real world, as it says here, by creating a user-centered, open, innovative ecosystem that engages scientists and the community in collaborative design and exploration. The Stone Living Lab has developed 4 principles: climate preparedness in the context of social and environmental justice, research into resilient solutions that go beyond simple seawalls, education and community engagement that connects in particular to communities and individuals who are especially vulnerable to climate impacts. And through this effort, we hope to help create a hub for community science and place-based education programs, a network of researchers, educators, and park managers building on the networks that exist already, and ladders of opportunity and job training for Boston area youth. The 4th area is policy. This is again an area that requires collaboration. And the idea is to collaborate to really inform policy so that adaptive solutions are easier to implement. Right now, there are barriers based on the regulations that are in place that are intended to protect the environment, but they've been written such that they are relatively restrictive in allowing adaptive, creative solutions. So, what kind of approaches is the Stone Living Lab taking? The first is to try to develop nature-based solutions. We had early on in the Stone Living Lab development, we had a visitor come in from a professor from China come in, and he talked about some pretty innovative work happening over there, and his core idea was we shouldn't be resisting the ocean. A wall resists the ocean and all the energy hits the wall. And eventually that wall will lose to the ocean. Instead, we should be creating solutions that are flexible and flow with the ocean energy. And that's more or less the principle behind nature-based solutions. These are just examples here, not specific Stone Living Lab plans. The other idea is to develop solutions that have co-benefits, ecological co-benefits, such as can be seen here with the bottom photo shows the kind of natural community that will naturally occur if there are cracks and crevices of various sizes and shapes in a coastal structure, as opposed to a flat concrete wall. Lucy Lockwood is a PhD candidate at UMass Boston, is currently doing some pilot research on this very thing associated with the lab. Also, social co-benefits are of course critical for all the reasons I mentioned above in the principles. We know that nature, we generally know that nature has a ton of value for people, aesthetic, economic, social, health. But the Stone Living Lab intends to drill into that with research and partnerships that will help identify those social co-benefits and ultimately find projects that can help us resist flooding or be resilient to flooding while also providing additional benefits. Here's a conceptual model of the kind of thing we might see out in the Boston Harbor Islands going forward. Not necessarily all in one place or all at one time, but you can see the range of types of experiments and studies that would be part of this idea. Utilizing all of the natural habitats that occur in the harbor, from seagrass to rocky intertidal and salt marsh environments on the coast. A particularly important area will of course be experiments on how the storm energy and the waves from storms can be absorbed, as I said before, as opposed to resisted in a way that will break down the seawalls like we've seen in the past. And linkages from the coastal to the upland, in addition to exhibits and recreational opportunities for the public. The partners have come together through this collective impact model, where the idea is, of course, each of these entities has its own infrastructure and its own objectives to work on. But by working together and with many folks that are not on this slide, we hope to make a greater collective impact by sharing a common driving goal and communicating actively with each other as we work on our own ways to meet these, to address the solutions. The Stone Living Lab includes an international scientific advisory committee that comments on the research and monitoring work we're doing, and a very large advisory board of many members, particularly focused in the Boston area, but beyond that, that helps advise the direction of the lab and helps us make decisions. Here's the advisory board list of participating organizations. So what's happening now? You're going to hear much more about this from Marc and Rebecca, but in general, what we're doing is sending out requests for proposals, such as this one that was just released this week, for any researchers, whatever their affiliation, to get some funding through the Stone Living Lab to research social and economic co-benefits of nature-based solutions for coastal flood protection. We are also starting some community science initiatives and working on developing educational partnerships. And in the science realm, which Marc will drill much more into, we've got a monitoring network set up, core research that's in the development and permitting process, and we're seeking external research projects as well. And with that, I will stop sharing and send it over to you, Marc.
Sorry, thank you. I'm going to turn off my screen, turn off my video here. It's just to keep, so it doesn't get too grainy when I'm giving my talk, save a little bandwidth. And yeah, so we're just going to jump in here. So basically, I'm going to talk about the research here at Stone Lab. And for the few minutes that I have you here, I'm going to talk about sea level rise, past, present, and future. It's important to understand, give us some context about what's going on with sea level rise. Then we'll talk about a little bit about Boston Harbor and the islands, their sort of formation, how they got there. And then we'll basically go through the research program right at the end to give you a sense of what we're doing. So we have a very understanding of the relationship between sea level rise, global temperature, and CO2. So the top line here, this is over the last 400,000 years. So this is a long-term data set. It's actually gotten from an ice core. So it's a famous study that was done in late 1990s where they went up and they drilled 2 miles down into the Greenland ice sheet. And they got all these wonderful data in terms of CO2, global temperature, and then they could use proxies to get at sea level rise. And we look at this data set, it's phenomenal. So the green is CO2, the red is the average temperature, and the blue is sea level. And you can see these patterns, right? You can see one peak after another, and they follow each other. And CO2 is the one that leads the gang here, right? So CO2 goes up, you see a peak right here in the CO2, global temperatures right after, and then the sea level rise right after that, right? Same thing here, you get the green, CO2, then sea level, then temperature, and then sea level. And it mixes around a little, but you definitely see this pattern here. But what I want to draw your attention to is the last little bit, right? The most recent data that we have. So this is a really unfortunate map right here. So this is the part of the chart. This is, to give you a little context, right? This is the last 50,000 years or so, and this is since the industrial age, right? This is going straight up. This is the CO2. This is 415 parts per million in 2020. So this is far above, let me just go back one here. Far above what we've seen in the last 400,000 years, the CO2 levels that we have here, right? So we're post-industrial age, we're putting a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. But what you see here along the, if you look back, global temperature hasn't gone up nearly as much, right? The sea level hasn't gone up nearly as much. And we look over that last 400,000 years, and these track really well with each other. So we haven't seen, and this is what gives us pause, right? We haven't seen that rise in temperature commensurate with the CO2. And that's why there's that lag. That's why when you hear scientists say, even if we stopped putting CO2 into the atmosphere today, sea level rise and global temperatures would still continue to rise because of that lag in between the time CO2 gets into the atmosphere and when it stops having that negative impact. So I talk about projection models into the future. I hear this a lot. I still hear this a lot. They can't predict the weather next week. What do they know about the climate in 20 years? And this, I generally start to develop like a facial twitch when I hear this. This drives me crazy. What we have here is, what I tell people is, imagine if I told you you were going to Miami Beach for 2 weeks in January. You know what to pack. You don't need to know what the weather is. You basically know what to pack. You're going to have a good sense of what to bring. If I say you're going to Augusta, Maine for 2 weeks in January, you're going to know what to pack, and you're not going to need to know what the weather is, right? You're going to have a good sense of it. Weather changes really, really quickly, and there's a lot of variability, and climate doesn't change that fast. Unfortunately, it changes, but it doesn't change that fast. So I'm going to show you, this image, I blotted out the right half of the image here. This is from the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from 1991. And what they did was they projected into the future what they thought sea level change would be. And then in 2013, 2014, at that last IPCC report that came out, they looked back and saw how accurate they were in 1990, right? So 1990 data here. I think you can see my mouse. This gray is their predictions. This is what they predicted in 1991. They went back and looked at it in 2013 to see how accurate they were. This is how accurate they were. They were right inside their predictions, but they were at the very high end of it, right? So that was for sea level rise. They did the same thing in 2001 when the next report came out, or a subsequent report came out. And this time they looked at fossil fuel. They looked at all these. I'm just showing you a few of them. They looked at the CO2 emissions based on different scenarios of how much CO2 we would burn. And they were again right on the money, but at the high end of their prediction, right? So this is an instance where these computers that they were using in 1990 and 2000 were really slow compared to what we have now, right? These computers they were using back then were about as strong as the ones in your hand, in your phone, right? So we were really pretty good at predicting this stuff when we look back at it. So now we're talking a little bit about Boston Harbor. You all know that we're in a glaciated area, right? There were glaciers here 26,000 years ago. The glaciers were at their maximum extent. They went all the way down to Cape Cod, the Vineyard, Nantucket, and Long Island here, and then they started to recede. The global temperatures increased. They started to melt and recede and dump all the material. But these ice sheets were massive, and it's hard to get a sense of how big they really were. And group did a study a few years ago and put this graphic together. It's pretty interesting. It's the thickness of ice sheets compared with modern skylines. So you look at Boston and you see the Prudential building here and the John Hancock building here. This ice sheet was 1,200 meters thick, and it was 3/4 of a mile thick. So these are massive, massive ice sheets. These aren't the ones you go up to Glacier National Park and they're a couple hundred feet high, right? This was 3/4 of a mile thick. It was a massive, massive ice sheet up in Boston. And then if anybody's doing the math up in Montreal, this ice sheet was 2 miles thick, right? So these are just, they dominate the landscape when they're here, obviously. And then when they start to recede, when you look at the really steep cliffs on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket and on Outer Cape Cod, these are those moraines, right? That's when the ice paused and melted, but didn't retreat and just dumped all this material out. And that's why if you ever drive on Cape Cod, you go over the Sagamore Bridge and you're driving down Route 6 and you're going east, you're driving right on a moraine, right along the top of the moraine. And I said, the glacial landscape just dominates everything. And as it melts, it leaves these structures behind, good old kettle ponds like Walden Pond, and then drumlins. And this is what we're going to talk about next. These are this material, this loose sediment that gets deposited underneath the glacier, and they're left over after the glacier melts. And we have lots of them in New England. There are drumlins everywhere. And when they formed in Boston Harbor, obviously the sea level was much lower then, right? It was a couple 200 feet, 250 feet lower than it is. So all these drumlins formed in Boston Harbor, and then the sea level rose and they got inundated. And there's only 3 places in the world where this happened, where you have drumlins in a marine environment, and that's in Ireland, Iceland, and here in Boston Harbor. And we've used these islands for all kinds of things. Post-colonial, we've done all kinds of things. We have military bases on the islands, landfills. There were people living out there, hospitals, all kinds of places. And most of them are eroding, obviously, which is pretty standard, and that's what's going on. But again, we've manipulated this coast so much. This is a wonderful illustration about how much we've illustrated. So this is how much we've changed the coast. This is the shoreline roughly in the 1880s, the early 1800s rather, in Boston. And we slowly filled in these areas over time, right? For those of you who ever been to the Back Bay, there's a reason why they call it the Back Bay, because it used to be the bay, right? We filled it in. And of course, recently, all Logan Airport, parts of South Boston. So we've done a lot of manipulation to this shoreline. And so we have what we have now. We have, thankfully, in the 90s or not too long ago, the Boston Harbor Islands National State Park was established to help, use these islands as a recreational area and preserve what we can out there. But some of the value of the islands, we're learning more and more. A few years ago, the Stone Foundation, which is one of the supporter for the Stone Living Lab, commissioned a study to look at what kind of protection the Boston Harbor Islands were affording the mainland, right? What were they actually doing? So Kirk Bosmer from Woods Hole Group and some folks from UMass started to look at this. And this is from a storm. This is a model of wave height from the storm Riley. You remember in January of 2018, we had the big blizzard, the big storm here, the new storm of record. And then in March, we had like 2 or 3 or 4 nor'easters back to back. And the biggest one was Riley. So this is modeled and measured wave data from that storm. And the peak storm, 24-foot waves way out here. And then as they come in here, the islands really knock down this wave energy. So what we did for the study is we removed the islands from Boston Harbor, right? And we saw what the wave energy would have done from Riley if those islands were removed. So as you can see, there's a lot more energy getting into Boston Harbor here. This is a much more higher energy shoreline there if these islands were here, because we really wanted to get away from the anecdotal and to really kind of quantify what the difference would be with those islands. So this is the difference, right? Let me go back. This is the existing waves, wave heights, and these little arrows give you the wave direction. And now you have all this for the islands removed, and then you have the difference. So if you look at this little green circle here, the difference in this green circle is 12 to 15 feet. That means if there were no islands here, you would have had a 12 to 15 foot wave that just went down to nothing, right? The islands dissipated all this wave energy, and they dissipated all of this in this whole area. So it's remarkable how much wave attenuation can happen with these wonderful islands that we have. So we are lucky to have them. And toward that end, or more in that direction, the Stone Lab is very interested in nature-based solutions. Marc talked about that a little bit. This is another example from, I swiped this, another slide from Kirk Bosma Woods Hole Group. This is an example of a nature-based solution at the Charleston bus garage. Charlestown, sorry, in bus garage. And again, when you have an eroding shoreline or you're concerned about it, if you can do a nature-based solution, you can get a lot of the benefits, the co-benefits that ecosystems like this can give you. So this is a really rudimentary drawing of a nature-based solution. So you have an eroding shoreline here, and you can plant salt marsh or encourage salt marsh growth. You can have a rocky intertidal environment, which is really wonderful habitat, right? You can have this cobble bank. So rather than having these big revetments with these massive stones, you have just a small cobble bank. So it can move and erode and accrete with big storms, things like that. And you sort of, you reduce the slope on these banks. So if waves do get up here, they're more likely to wash over as opposed to erode the bank. And there's all these little things that we do. But what happens with these, honestly, is that there's a problem. People get called and they build something like this, which is great, better than seawalls, better than revetments. But there's no science going on here. There's no monitoring. The monitoring that happens is always after it goes in, right? They have to do a site characterization, but then they do the monitoring after the fact. And that's not the way you really want to do science. So what's really special about the Stone Living Lab is we're going to do these experiments at scale. So we're not going to do 10 feet or 20 feet. We're going to do hundreds of feet of alteration to a shoreline. But we're going to do an experiment there. We're going to do a lot of data collection before it happens, and then during, and then after. And that hasn't happened anywhere in the world. That's very difficult to do. And we're trying to do it right here. We're trying to do real experiments at scale. It's integrated research, which means it's physical, it's geological, it's biological, it's chemical. We're going to do all the things that happen. So maybe there's a negative here with erosion, but maybe there's a positive here with all the growth, the biological growth and biodiversity that happens. And we're just trying to try and understand how ecosystems can evolve and what the benefits and drawbacks are. Oversampling, when we have this monitoring program that I'll talk about in a bit that Marc mentioned, there's going to be a lot of unexpected and rare events. We want to just get a lot of data and figure out how to do it. What's the data you really need? We want to make sure it's applied. So yeah, we're doing good science, but you don't want to do it in a bubble. You want to work with regulators to say, you know what, if we can do this here, we can do it in other places, and we can start to increase the influence that a lab like this has. And then, of course, it has to be adaptive. You can't just build it, let it sit. We have to understand that this is going to change. We have increasing storm frequency and intensity, sea level rise, and all the things that climate change are going to bring. So we have to plan on being adaptive. So the monitoring system is going to be real-time and continuous. We're going to have all these data coming in. And we're just going to have a whole suite of information coming in for different researchers. Because, again, we have ecologists and geologists, biologists. So it's going to be a really interesting data set that's coming in. And then we're going to be able to ask and answer questions that you wouldn't be able to if you didn't have this monitoring system. The last few slides here. So we have this core research that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll have the other facets that the Stone Living Lab is doing. But first, let me talk about the core research. So the core research in years 2 to 5, and we're in year 2 right now. So we're just getting going. We're starting to do some data collection out there. I'm conducting an island sedimentation, sea level rise, and coastal resiliency project. And what's going to happen is all these projects that I'm going to mention are going to feed into the monitoring, right? We're going to get information from the monitoring, but then the results of our study is designed to improve the monitoring, right? There's going to be erosion studies. There's going to be studies on biodiversity and ecosystem services that you can get on coastal protection structures. There's going to be what are the actual ecological value of a dynamic revetment, cobble berm, as opposed to a regular one. We're looking at doing research on developing robust policies for nature-based solutions, so it's easier to do these kinds of things in the future because the permitting is rigorous. It's very intense. The other thing is numerical modeling. We want to make sure we can do more modeling in the future. And then all of these projects are going to sort of inform each other. And that's why we designed them all in the same way. They're standalone, but they're going to inform all the others. So it's going to be a really wonderful network collection of studies. And then all this information goes into what we're thinking of as the real transformational stuff, the transformational research in year 6. We're going to build this structure, this tiered structure we're calling the REACT system, Resilient Ecosystem Adaptable Coastal Tiered System. It's a mouthful. It's a REACT system. So we're taking all the core research that we're doing, all the monitoring, and we tie it into this, and then we put all these other pieces together. Right? We have a rapid response program wherein if there are storms, we can go out there and measure before and after a storm. We're going to encourage external research to come to the lab because, yes, it's a big lab, but you can always do more in different places. As Marc mentioned, we just did this request for proposals. So we're going to encourage other folks to come from outside the lab because that collaboration is invaluable. And then the community science, and Rebecca's going to talk a little bit about this. We really are getting folks, local people in and around Boston Harbor to help us collect data and scientific data. And they've really sort of reacted to this. So I think, Rebecca, I'm going to run the slides, and you can just tell me when to advance.
Okay, sounds good. So let me just pull myself up here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I first want to talk a little bit about, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's okay. The very first one that has 3 boxes in it. The first thing that I'm just going to talk about is the overall engagement vision of the lab and where my work fits in and what we hope to be able to start rolling out in this year and future years coming down the line. So our real goal is to engage with Boston area communities at several different levels through programming, through networking, and we want to be sure, because the Stone Lab is focused on Boston Harbor and Boston, that we want to really locally engage with folks with projects that are really relevant to what's going on around them. And particularly using our different partnerships, which both Marcs have mentioned with UMass Boston, National Parks of Boston. There's many different groups that we're working on right now, collaborating with to engage people at different levels, different age groups, different communities, because one of the things about climate change is that it affects everyone. So we want to be sure that we're reaching all different kinds of people and meeting them where they are. So one of our first sort of big buckets of engagement is education engagement with students, teachers, and schools. And some potential examples of what we're working on include professional development for teachers, being able to take teachers out and about to different sites, including islands, areas that are using nature-based solutions, different experiments, and really showcasing to teachers what's going on in the area, how climate change is affecting their communities. And then they can bring that back and develop curriculum particularly for their schools and for their students. We also would hope to be able to offer internships or exposure opportunities with some of our researchers for different students at different levels, as well as develop some educational resources particular to Boston. There's certainly lots of great climate change curricula out there, but there aren't necessarily any that are specific to what's going on in Boston. So we also definitely hope to collaborate with some of our partners to put together that kind of material. Second, we're also looking into different kinds of public events. So we want to be able to engage folks, not just particularly students and teachers, but also the general public, and be able to engage not just communities that live here, but visitors that might come to our city, to the park, and to the islands. And so this can include things like providing one-off opportunities for folks to engage with citizen or community science, which I'll talk about last, as well as opportunities like hosting tours of some of the nature-based solutions that are going on in our city, not just on the islands, as well as hosting different climate discussion groups. What are opportunities that we can bring people together to share about not just what the research of the lab is doing, but what are people themselves experiencing through climate change? What are their feelings and what are their worries? What are their concerns? Providing a platform for people to be able to engage. And definitely some of our events this year and going forward will probably be virtual. We've really seen, this is a great opportunity to reach different people, not just in Boston, but others who are curious. It also provides sometimes easier access. Certainly one of the challenges of the islands is getting folks out to them. And so being able to host virtual events will really be a key piece of all of our programming. But we do hope, hopefully maybe later this summer or into the future to be able to host in-person events as well. So the third kind of column in our engagement strategy and our vision is the citizen and community science branch. So Marc, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is community and citizen science, because some of you may be familiar or even have participated in citizen science projects before, but there's been a growing development to shape it more to be what's called community science. So first off, citizen science is If you're familiar, you might be familiar with the term, but it's typically describes a project where a researcher or an institution or a project has a question and utilizes folks who live in the area to collect data, gather observations. Sometimes they might analyze the data, but typically it's a way to engage local folks to collect data for that project. And one of the great things about citizen science is that it really expands the realm in terms of how much data folks can collect, how often they can collect it. Oftentimes a traditional project might be limited by the number of staff, the number of researchers, the seasonality, but being able to utilize people who live in the area, they can go out maybe more regularly, collect data more often, and also have a lot more local knowledge. So you might be able to rely on some community members to be able to describe, if you're interested in this certain question, I actually know a really specific spot in a park that might be really helpful, for example. However, there's been a shift in terms of both the design of projects and the terminology of projects from citizen to community science. And one of the reasons is that citizen, particularly in the United States, has, is a pretty loaded term. And we want to be sure that everyone feels welcome and feels like they are a person who can contribute to these projects. So this is something that's been kind of spearheaded in the US, but certainly folks around the world are also adopting this terminology. And we also want to make sure that in this shift, the way that these projects are designed is also changing. So in the next slide, Mark, you'll see this is a pretty simplistic diagram of the way projects typically have been designed and what the goal is really for the field in general and how we design these projects and work with communities. So you can see on the left there, this is a more traditional citizen science project where a researcher or institution or organization has a research question. They go to the community, recruit for the specific question. The community members provide that data, but it's really provided back to the researchers, and then they analyze and create output. Hopefully they also share out with their volunteers or citizen scientists what they've found, but it's a pretty one-way relationship. It's going in and activating these communities, but not necessarily involving them with the entire process. So on the right, you can see what the evolution is heading towards in terms of true community science. And this is where the community is integral to the development of a research question, the methods, the collection, the data analysis, and then hopefully the action from that project. So there's certainly room for both of these kinds of styles in the field, but we particularly at the Stone Lab and in kind of the field in general are really pushing towards this more community science model because it does provide much more space for voices that aren't traditionally heard maybe in these kinds of projects to be able to voice their concerns and issues that are important to them, questions they have, and also provides a lot more room for expertise that might not be traditionally considered as valid, perhaps through, well, if this person doesn't have a PhD, then perhaps their knowledge isn't as valuable. We know that's not necessarily the case, that there's lots of different kinds of local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge that we really want to elevate and make sure we're utilizing, again, with something like climate change in particular, because this is a very urgent issue and it's definitely going to affect all of us. So this is a great way to really bring everyone to the table and get all of these different perspectives and hopefully answer some interesting questions and solve some problems. So particularly, we're going to talk about our very first project that we've been working on. Next slide, please, about beach profiling. And this is a project where we've gone out and we've been recruiting with local communities, particularly around specific beaches, to be able to build up these teams of beach profilers who are kind of adopting these beaches as places where they're going to start answering scientific questions. So what is going on in this picture? These two women are collecting a beach profile, and a beach profile is measuring the shape of the beach as it heads down to the shore. So typically, the profile will be going downwards and sloping down to the water. Depends on the steepness of the slope, depends on the tide as well. So the reason why we are asking folks to collect this information is, first off, we love beaches, and we love beaches for different reasons. You might go to sunbathe, to look for sea glass, to just walk along the water. And we're really interested in knowing how the beaches are changing shape both over time seasonally, as well as before and after storm events. And as we know from what both the Marcs have talked about, with sea level rise and increasingly powerful storms, we're having a lot more wave action hitting these beaches, and our beaches are going to be changing in more and more dramatic ways. And so by going out, these teams go out once a month, as well as before and after storm events, to measure how the shape of the beach is changing. At each site, we have a site leader who's kind of our designated point person who organizes their cohort team. And some of the teams include friends of beach groups, residents who live in the area. One of our staff folks on this call is actually a newly minted site leader. So we're really focusing on bringing in people who not just enjoy beaches in general, but have a specific beach that they live nearby and they really care about. And so in the next slide, we actually have a video from another citizen science project showing a time lapse of a beach over several months up to a year, and the natural change that happens, but it's really dramatic. So this is a single beach over time, and you can see that the shape changes really dramatically between certain storm events, likely, if it breaks through and causes a washover. But beaches naturally change between winter and summer. And the summer beaches actually get bigger because the gentle wave action deposits sand onto the beach. And in the winter, they actually shrink because the more powerful storms eat it away. But we really want to get an idea of what are our beaches doing? What is normal behavior for them? What might be happening because of climate change? And what are some ways that maybe we can start to predict or have an idea of what's going to happen next? So you can head off to the next slide. We have a couple of opportunities if you are intrigued by the idea of citizen and community science and want to get involved. We have a couple of avenues. First off, this image on the left here is a map of all of our beach sites. The blue ones are ones that have site leaders already. So if you live near one of these beaches and you're intrigued by this project, you can reach out and we can put you in touch with that site leader and you can join a team. The sites in orange are potential sites that we're interested in, but we actually don't have any site leaders yet. So if you'd be interested in spearheading a team to go out on monthly monitoring sessions, please send a note to that email below, beachprofiling@stonelivinglab.org, and we would be happy to get in touch. Folks who are site leaders, we provide all of the equipment to you. We also do an online training. And the nice thing is that when you're measuring the profile, you have two folks who are each holding a stick with a string between, and it's perfectly 6 feet apart. So it's also something that you can do safely outside and be able to collect important data. The two other citizen science projects that you can get engaged with right at the end of this month that we also wanted to plug. One is the City Nature Challenge, which I believe we're going to be hearing a little bit more about. So I don't want to take away too many details, but the City Nature Challenge is a project run through iNaturalist, which is a great app that's a way to collect information on biodiversity. You can also use it to identify all different kinds of organisms living near you. And the City Nature Challenge is a program where there's a friendly competition between different cities in the US, internationally, to see who can collect the most observations. So I think Jill's going to be sharing a little bit more information about that at the end. And then also the My Coast app, which is a project run through the Coastal Zone Management Office. It also organizes a program around king tide events. So the end of this month, we're going to be seeing an astronomical high tide, also called a king tide, which will be over 12 feet, I believe April 29th and 30th. And this app is a great way to go out and share observations of what the flooding looks like near you or along the coast. So this is a sort of a bittersweet opportunity. You can go out and see some pretty impressive tidal action, go out, snag a picture and share it on this app. It'll also give you a bit of an idea of what sea level rise means for Boston. There are areas that are now, whenever these high tides hit, are underwater. So particularly areas like Long Wharf or Morrissey Boulevard, those are spots that now flood with these really high tides. So it's a chance to go out and, as Marc Albert referred to, you can't really stop the ocean. It's a time to go out and really see what this might mean for the city. All right, next, you can head off to the next slide. So that's sort of an overview of all of what we're envisioning for our engagement projects, and certainly keep an eye on our website. You can also sign up for a newsletter to be able to hear more about our different opportunities as they come online. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Which I believe I'm also monitoring. So just give me a moment to check through the questions here.
I noticed one of the questions was why no beach profiling sites on the South Shore? And we're actually thinking about adding one in Duxbury. So that's a potential site. So we are looking into it. We did try and focus them around Boston Harbor, obviously, because it's about Boston Harbor, but we went up to Swampscott and down the Holland, and we're looking into going into Duxbury. So there may be more to come.
Yeah, and Marc Borrelli, could you maybe speak a little bit about that rapid response bubble that you had referred to on your slide? I saw a couple of folks were asking about that.
Sure. The rapid response is for research, so it's for other scientists to come and participate. But I can tell you that if you're interested, and that was a lot of some of that is about beach profiling. It's about going out after a storm, seeing what happens before and after a storm, and that's usually really tough data to get. The beach profiling group will be doing the same kind of thing. They're supposed to be doing the monthly, but if there's a big storm, and we're gonna try and notify people when. But you can look at the National Weather Service sites and you can kind of figure that out yourself. But we're trying to figure out a way to contact all the teams in a way that says, okay, there's a big storm projected for tomorrow. Can you go out and get maybe a before and then an after? So the rapid response program in and of itself is really for researchers to collect data. We hadn't really planned on the rapid response module to sort of be for the public, but if you wanted to do that kind of stuff, you could be involved in the community science beach profiling, where you could go right out after a storm and see and really measure what happens. So again, trying to get beyond the anecdotal and really go out and make some high accuracy, high resolution measurements.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you yourself are a resident or have particular questions you're interested in, definitely reach out. I mean, we are interested in what the community is interested in researching. So there's luckily right now, because we're new and very flexible, there's lots of opportunity to investigate and figure out what are some interesting research topics. I have a question from Rob here, which I guess I'll offer to either Marc. What are some nature-based solutions that would also have immediate economic benefits? For example, aquaculture, tourism, et cetera.
Marc, do you want to go?
Well, I think one of them was sort of named there in the question, which is aquaculture, if done sort of sensitively. We've heard some proposals that would use sort of traditional indigenous sort of kelp farming techniques, which can be done sustainably. And that might have some protective benefit because kelp is a very fast growing and large species in some areas. So that's one good idea. Other than that, I really don't know what's an immediate economic benefit nature-based solution. That's sort of part of the core idea of the lab, is to spend a number of years probably researching these things so that we can really make an impact.
I think the thing to remember too is it's not just the added benefit of a living shoreline, it's the preventative benefit. You're stopping something bad a negative impact from happening, right? So you have an eroding bank, you have an eroding bluff that might be getting closer to a road or a street or something that you want to protect. So you're protecting whatever behind that living shoreline. So that in and of itself is giving you an economic benefit, right? So that's we don't want to forget that too.
All right, Valerie on Facebook asked, how does maintaining a manicured lawn impact climate change? And what are some beneficial changes that we could make that regular folks living at home can make that are easy to implement and could also potentially improve climate change? I can certainly speak to a little bit about manicured lawns. I mean, my background most immediately is water quality, and I can certainly say that maintaining a really ultra green lawn is pretty bad for water quality. You get lots of runoff from lawns, including fertilizer, pesticides, and anything that goes into the waterways eventually is going to end up in the water that you drink. So that's something that's not great. And also, lawns are not very biodiverse. So all of the benefits you might get from a lush meadow or from really, areas that have lots of different plants, you're not going to get with the lawn. So definitely, I know a lot of folks are all about like getting rid of your lawns, letting them go back to nature, stop mowing, stop, clearing out your leaves. Honestly, it seems like it just makes life a lot easier. You can just sort of sit back and let your lawn become a native landscape.
The direct impact of what you were talking about, Rebecca, with reducing pesticides and fertilizers, all those products are, a net carbon emission source. And the the kind of species that would grow into a former lawn area are going to be a carbon sink. So there's that sort of direct benefit.
Yeah, I'm a coastal geologist. I don't know much about lawns. Although I did read a story once that said the golf course at Augusta was one of the most unnatural environments on the planet, which I think is interesting because it's so controlled that it's just not a natural setting at all. It's really unusual.
But yeah, in terms of specific actions that folks can take at home, I think a lot of us know some of the familiar ones, bike, not drive. If you are able to get a hybrid or an EV vehicle, utilize that. But a really important thing, and that's why one of the reasons why the Stone Lab is interested in policy is that a lot of the real drivers of climate change aren't necessarily individual people, but are in fact these larger corporations or the governments, countries. And so as much as we can, bring it home, a lot of times it's about getting involved with your local government, with your local community, voting. A lot of these decisions made in cities and towns have a huge impact. So definitely, get involved. If you feel like running for city council, things like that, those are really, really great ways. We have lots of questions coming in fast here. So let me pull up another one. So let's see here. So we have a question about ethics. So we're talking about the quantification of benefits or co-benefits of nature-based solutions. Scientific, regulatory, and cultural groups all have different priorities. So I wonder if the Stone Living Lab has a way to establish ways to make these commensurate, to quantify benefits versus detriments that aren't similar. So how do we compare benefits that people might hold in different value?
Well, I think this person should apply to the RFP that we just sent out. Right, that's one of the things. That's one of the things we're trying to figure out because there are a lot of diverse groups and there are competing interests, and that's the thing you find at the coast. It's one of the places in the world where you have some of the most competing interests, right? So I think that's a really, really important question. It's why it's in our guiding principles because we need to figure this out. Right, we need to get a good sense of this, and we're scientists, so we want to be as unbiased, which is really important, right? We want to set this kind of research up so it's as unbiased as it can be. And it's a tricky question. It's a very, very tricky question.
I would note that the harbor barrier study that the UMass Boston and other partners did, they didn't exactly try to reduce all the different elements to a common sort of variable that could be easily compared, with one single unit of measurement. But that was a very specific effort to look across all possible layers of impact, just like all the ones you mentioned. So that study really did try to do that. So I would look there first as a sort of the starting point for considering how we might move forward on that question.
Yeah, and Marc, Albert, would you be able to speak a little bit about some of our partnerships and working with the various tribes in the area?
Yeah, we're fortunate to have Elizabeth Solomon participating in the executive committee of the Stone Living Lab. She's part of the Massachusetts tribe, excuse me. And we have a lot from the Stone Living Lab perspective, we have a lot to learn about indigenous ways of sort of sustainably living on the land, and also the sort of the long view. right now we're, this whole presentation is sort of about, we have to, be resilient to climate change now because it's a crisis. And I'm coming to learn that is not necessarily the sort of a common perspective among Indigenous folks who have a much longer view and much longer ancestry in this area. How that translates into how we can live sustainably, with the coast across the Boston Harbor region. That's an area of exploration. I probably should have highlighted that as part of, sort of one of the areas of exploration that the Stone Living Lab is investigating. We recently had an internal seminar about that. Separately from that, the National Park Service has a responsibility to make sure that there's sort of authentic voices bringing forward all the histories and the contemporary, sort of understanding of the places that are national parks. And the Boston Harbor Islands as a national and state park is such a place with an incredibly long history of indigenous folks who have incredibly survived what essentially was the first focused genocidal act by at the time a colonial government right here or right there in Boston Harbor. So we have a lot to learn about all of that and about how to live sustainably and how to survive crises in a coastal environment. And beyond that, I have a lot to learn. I'm looking forward to continue to exploring that.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Carol that's an interesting sort of thought experiment, and I'll pose this to you, Marc Borrelli, which is, since waves are providing damaging energy to the islands and to our coast, are we or are others, looking at using that energy to create electricity using wave energy? And would creating those kind of structures be able to reduce erosion or provide some of this resiliency we're looking for?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of research going on with tidal energy, right? Tides are dependable. You know when they're coming, you know when they're going. The trick is always not to do damage to the life that's surrounding it, right? That's always the tricky part when you're dealing with the ocean. You're trying to harness. It's the same thing with wind turbines, right? You don't want to damage the birds or the wildlife, things like that. Wave energy, there are people who are working on wave energy because waves over the long period can be pretty predictable, right? If you think about long periods of time, you're going to get a certain amount of wave energy here. It would be tricky to do in Boston Harbor. It is somewhat sheltered. And if you're going to go for this kind of thing, you usually want to get, if you're building wind turbines, you want to build in the windiest area you can find. If you want to build something for waves, you want to build it someplace where you're going to get really big waves. So we haven't really thought about that question. It's interesting. We haven't thought about that question for the Stone Lab, but that's that external research part. So people want to come to us and try things out. We're open to ideas, right? We're open to thinking about stuff. That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one.
Yes, and I think a key part of this, as with much of our work, as Marc Albert alluded to, is also permitting and being able to install these kinds of things is complicated, particularly in a harbor like ours. There's lots of activity going on, so it's an interesting thing to think about. Well, I think we have time for perhaps one or two more questions, and I have a question here, which is really, I think, great for especially Boston Harbor Now interests and folks at the national parks, which is, what are the best ways to get people in the city out to the Boston Harbor Islands so they will appreciate them more? It's still pretty expensive and inconvenient, and access is kind of difficult for many folks who live in the city. So what do we think are some strategies to get people out to these incredible resources? So I'll put that out to you first, Marc Albert, and then if someone from BHN wants to add in their thoughts as well, that'd be great.
Well, I was sort of going to say the same thing, which is that Boston Harbor Now, working with DCR, the Massachusetts State Parks Agency, and the Park Service, have a very extensive set of free access programs that are available to in some cases individuals, in some cases community groups, to get folks essentially tickets to the ferries that go out to the Boston Harbor Islands. So that's one major way. There's other programs throughout the year such as community cruises that are offered through Boston Harbor Now, based in individual communities around Boston Harbor that are either free or very low cost for the participants. Those don't actually land on the islands, but they sort of tour around the harbor. Those are a couple ways. And I'd be happy to hear from anyone at Boston Harbor Now or Jill Starowski, my colleague in visitor services, with other thoughts.
Hi, yeah, this is Rebecca Smerling. I'm from Boston Harbor Now. And just to chime in, some other options is in May and in June, we'll be having a half price Friday for every Friday during that time. And most libraries at this point also have a buy one, get one program. And if your library doesn't have one, they can reach out to us and we can set them up with one. So that's another great option. And that's the entire, that's for most, the entire season. We also have an extensive voucher program. If you work with nonprofits, please get in touch with us. These are great ways that we really do try to reach out to the community and have many options that fit sort of a way for everyone to get there. And if you have other specific questions, please reach out to us either through our social media channels or you can actually just at info@bostonharbornow.org and we can try to figure out the best way for you.
Great. All right. So I'm going to offer up one last question here, which is a little bit of a softball to myself, but feel free, Marc and Marc, to chime in, which is, do you have information about how communities perceive and or understand the issue of sea level rise? That's a great question. And that's actually part of what we're really interested in our work, because we're not, it's not something that is necessarily quantified or known. There has been research, for example, the UMass Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab has done an extensive survey about how different groups, particularly different racial groups, are perceive of climate change, feel prepared for climate change. One of the interesting things is that a lot of the climate change threats that folks are experiencing right now might not be sea level rise. It's things like urban heat, which is a huge problem for communities that, particularly in environmental justice communities that are lacking green space. It's a really big problem. A lot of people still don't have air conditioning in Boston. So that's something that's a really pressing issue. Other pressing issues might be if infrastructure is having failure issues due to the heat or perhaps due to flooding. So that's one of the things that we're interested in, is not just what are the issues that are really urgent and really of interest to people, and then also particularly with sea level rise. What are folks' perception of it? How are they concerned about it? And are they prepared for it? That's one of the sort of strange pieces of climate change, and we talk about a lot, is that the ocean is going to rise and things are going to have to change and people are actually going to have to move. How prepared are people for that sort of incident? And certainly we saw with some extreme flooding that T-stops might flood. How is the city going to be prepared to deal with those scenarios? So that's part of our work, is being able to talk to communities about this particular issue, but certainly the suite of climate change issues that are going to be and are affecting communities. All right. Well, I think that's really covers a lot of the questions that we had here. Marc, any other last remarks to add?
Nope, I think you got it.
I'll just say that as we've been saying, the idea of a living lab is that it's participatory, dynamic, and community connected. So really love all these questions that contributes to what we're trying to do. And if you have critique or good ideas or anything, we would really love to hear from you now and into the future. This is not intended to be a closed ecosystem. We are very much looking to connect with anyone and everyone who might want to discuss and or work on these same goals with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much again to Marc and Rebecca. And this has been a fabulous introduction to the Stone Living Lab and all the wonderful work that's happening now and will be happening in the future. And thank you also to our audience. Thank you so much for coming out to spend time with us this evening. If you, like me, have a question that pops into your head an hour or two after this presentation, or while you're having your morning coffee tomorrow morning, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We can put our email address in the chat here. It'll be boha_information@nps.gov, and we'll be sure that your questions are passed on to our presenters, and we want to help you out and answer anything that you might want to learn more about this special initiative. If you are also looking for other virtual engagement opportunities, we are currently midway through our National Park Week and April School Vacation Week. Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, along with the National Parks of Boston and Boston Harbor Now, have been sharing some great stories of our special sites on our Facebook and Instagram pages. So if you want to check out these through our National Park Week and April School Vacation events on the Boston Harbor Island Facebook page, Brittany is going to be great, and she's going to put those links in the chat for you. There's also a link on our .org site for you to follow. Also, if you and your family are looking for a fun activity downtown, you can follow a story walk at the Charlestown Navy Yard tomorrow and Friday to read along Ruby's Birds, which is a beautiful story about a young girl who finds joy in looking for birds in her urban neighborhood. This story walk will be set up again near our downtown Boston Harbor Islands Welcome Center this Saturday and Sunday. Both of those days, our staff will be on site from 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock on Saturday and from 12 to 2 on Sunday to hand out Junior Ranger books, National Park Week stickers, and just share any information or anything you may have questions about. And we'll share a link in the chat again for you to find out more information about these activities. And lastly, as Rebecca alluded to earlier in the presentation, 9 days from now is the start of the City Nature Challenge. This is a way for everyone to get involved with documenting nature in their own city or even your own backyard. You can take observations of the species that we have been learning about. You can go to the Boston area City Nature Challenge landing page to learn more. Join the project on iNaturalist and learn how to use iNaturalist using the links in the chat. Be sure to keep an eye on Park's social media and web pages to learn more over the next week. And lastly, I'd like to pass it over to Brittany Knotts, representing the Boston Harbor Now Programs Department, for some closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. If I can find my script, here we go. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Boston Harbor Now is deeply grateful to our partners at Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, the National Park Service, the Stone Living Lab, and Foundation for their collaboration on our virtual programming. We couldn't do it without them, and we couldn't do it without you, our audience. Thank you once more for being here this evening, and we hope to see you at one of the many parks along the Harbor Walk or out on the Harbor Islands in just about a month when we open for the early season. And if there are any more questions, we are happy to take those, as Jill said, at the info email address that we dropped into the chat. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Have a great night.